Welcome back, everybody, to your professional diploma in digital marketing and SEO. Today, we are looking at understanding metrics. So more specifically, what we are covering today is, first up, we will look at different objectives and KPIs in more detail than we have done so in the past in Module 1. We'll then move on to campaign and always-on analysis. And that involves creating a PCA. So we will go through the steps to do that. Then finally, we will end off with analysis tools. So let us get started. We are looking at KPIs and other stats based on objectives. Remember that with digital marketing, when you're setting your objective, that is determining your KPIs. I often find that people get confused or think it's way more complex to determine your KPIs, but it really isn't. And I hope that you come to understand that in previous lessons and, of course, this one. KPIs often overlap as each goal informs the other, and this is referring to the funnels. So when you're reaching or trying to reach people at the top of the funnel, the idea is to try and bring them down, of course, to the bottom of the funnel. So that is why KPIs would overlap. We're going to look at some upper funnel objectives and based on different channels, looking at awareness and engagement as objectives. Now, this is not just KPIs. There are certain other things that we would call dimensions or things on their own, but I've included them here because this is what you would need to consider when looking at your email strategy or your email channels. So awareness, what you would need to consider is your open rates. So that is your CTR, the number of people who have clicked versus the sends that have happened, spam complaints, and unsubscribes. And of course, the reason for this is because if you're frustrating people enough for them to complain or to put you in spam, then that's a problem with your strategy and you need to relook it, or your targeting at the very least. There's also your unsubscribes for the same reason as spam complaints. People who aren't interested or are perhaps receiving too many emails would be unsubscribing. And of course, you don't want to see that number increase too much. You'd ideally see it decrease. If we look at engagement, then there are a few more things to consider. Of course, you still have your open rates, that is an engagement, spam complaints, your unsubscribes, then your link clicks, your shares, and your replies. If we then look at social and the same upper funnel objectives of awareness and engagement, of course, social is the perfect platform for these two objectives. Awareness, you would look at your impressions and therefore your CPM, so your cost per 1,000 impressions, the frequency with which the ads are being served to people, the ad recall or lift, which might only be available in certain channels. Impressions and frequency, reach and engagement rate would be very common metrics across all channels. And even though we are in the objective of awareness, it is important to look at your engagement rate, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you are targeting the right people, that the people who are becoming aware of your business are the people that would be your ideal customers, or at least most of them. For engagement, you would look at the engagement rates. Then you'd also look at the different engagement types, and these will differ across the social channels. Then your page follows, so how many people have liked your page or followed your page as a result of the ads that you have served. CTR would be important to look at if you have linked to something off Facebook, so let's say your website. Of course, then you want to monitor that CTR. And then shares, which is technically an engagement type, so I could have put it in there, but I wanted to keep it separate because I think that is more of a valuable engagement type than the others. They're sharing it, they have resonated with the content, they think it's funny or whatever it is, and they have decided to share it with their followers. Then we have display, which is actually, I know, a channel that we haven't covered in much detail so far, but we will do later on. not in today's lesson. Looking at awareness, what you would look at is impressions and therefore the CPM, your CTR, because you'll be directing them to your site. Then we would move on to analytics metrics, just because there's not really much more you could do with display. Of course, you can look at your audiences and your targeting if you have a standard display campaign and not a smart display campaign, which just makes everything automated. So you would need to look at these metrics to determine whether the type of traffic that you're bringing through from display is valuable, just because with this kind of channel you can get a huge amount of impressions for a very low cost. So you would look at the number of users that have come from display in terms of traffic. Then you have your bounce rate, which will come up a lot. You'd want to monitor that to ensure that most of the traffic isn't just bouncing off your page, because that would indicate that your targeting is incorrect or that your website has an issue. Then you would also look at the exit pages to determine where obviously people have exited, and then to look into those pages and try to determine why. Then moving on to engagement. Now, display isn't necessarily a channel that you would choose for an engagement objective, but if you did, then it would be looking at CTR, your session duration, so the amount of time that people are spending on your site, your bounce rate, your subscribers, and this is of course only if you have something that people would subscribe to. Let's say it's a newsletter or a blog, just as two examples. And then the top pages that people are visiting on your site. This could be by volume, this could be by session duration. It really just depends on the finer details of the goal. Then moving on to SEO, things that would indicate awareness here would be organic sessions. So the amount of traffic that you are receiving organically, that is something that you would track. Your bounce rate, again, your session duration, your direct traffic, so people who have typed in your URL directly into their browser bar or have bookmarked it. You would also want to look at the search terms. So this is something that an SEO person would be monitoring all the time and working on increasing your page rank for the top keywords or just certain keywords. And you would want to know which of these search terms is giving you the most impressions, has the highest click-through rates. So those other metrics which also apply to paid media would fit in here. Then, because awareness is really about attracting new users, you would look at the percentage of your new users versus your returning users. And ideally, you would want to see the new users percentage increasing. Then looking at engagement, we would also look at CTR, the bounce rate, the page depth, which is referring to how many pages they visit, the session duration to see how long they spent on the site, the exit pages, and then your new versus returning users. Then if we look at some lower funnel objectives, we have sales and we have leads. So for email, which as you know is a fantastic platform because it has such a high return on investment. And remember, the reason for this is because in comparison to other channels, it's actually really affordable. One could say cheap. Then, so you would look at your open rates. And I didn't say this before, but just remember that the open rate is really to do with your subject line as well as who you are. So it can be a combination of one or the other or both that determines whether someone opens the email. But this is why your subject lines are so important. Then you would look at your link clicks again. Your conversion rate, and this is incredibly important, that is something that you can really control in terms of your landing pages, the products that you're showing, how they are shown, whether the product descriptions are clear. All those kinds of things have to do with conversion rate. Your return on investment. Then you'd want to look at your average order value as well. And if this is not something that you have in place in whatever dashboard or analytics you're looking at, it's simply looking at your overall revenue and dividing it by the number of transactions. You'd also want to look at your new versus returning users and see whether there are any marked differences in terms of their average order value, the different volumes that you have, and you can then optimize based on those results. Then your CPA. So how much did it cost to send that email out? Very often email service providers don't have a cost per email, but of course you would generally be paying a monthly fee or something like that. So you would take that into account and just divide that by the number of people who have purchased. If you're wanting to get leads out of your email marketing, you would look at your open rates again, your link clicks, your conversion rate, your bounce rate. You would also look at your CPL, so your cost per lead, and it works the same way as your CPA. Moving on to social, if we have sales, you would be looking at your CTR because you would be directing them to your site to make a purchase. Unless you're using a product catalog or a shopping campaign or shoppable Instagram, that is something that is then purchased within the site, but there would still be a CTR to consider. Your conversion rate, incredibly important when it comes to sales. And as I mentioned, that is something that you would want to look at increasing over time. Your CPA, your average order value, and your return on investment or return on ad spend, depending on what data or information you have available. If the objective is leads, then quite simple, it would be your CTR, your conversion rate, and then your cost per lead. This could vary hugely depending on if you're using a lead form that is on Facebook, so the lead gen objective with the lead form, or if it's click to web, so you're directing people to a form on your site. If we look at search engine marketing for sales and leads, just because display doesn't really suit these objectives hugely, then for sales, you would look at your CTR, your conversion rate, your cost per click, because of course that has an effect on your CPA, your return on investment and return on ad spend. Your impression share is something that you would want to monitor, especially on top terms, so top converting terms. You want to make sure your impression share is pretty high, because if your conversion rate remains consistent and you increase your volume, then you will receive more performance or you will perform better. And of course, your CPA. If we look at leads, you would be looking at CTR, conversion rate, your cost per click, your cost per lead, and also your impression share. You wouldn't be looking at your return on investment or return on ad spend at this point, perhaps because it's just leads. They haven't converted yet, so you might not have that information. To get that kind of information, you would need to know what the conversion rate is from lead to sale. Some businesses are quite happy to share that information with you and others aren't, so you just need to work around it really. Moving on to SEO, if your objective is sales, then you would be looking at the search queries, so especially the queries that are bringing in those sales, your CTR, the number of transactions, your average order value, the bounce rate, the performance of the landing pages that you're sending traffic to. Very often in a sales campaign or sales situation, you will have multiple landing pages. Your exit pages as well, your new versus returning people, and then your page rank. And this is where you appear on the search engine results page. If we move to leads, very similar. It would be search queries, the CTR, the number of leads that you're receiving versus transactions, the bounce rate, your landing pages, your exit pages, the new versus returning users, and page rank. It might sound strange to include the returning users on the leads section, but it's just something to keep an eye on because people very often submit multiple forms, sometimes even with different email addresses or contact numbers, so you can't actually tell that it's a duplicate. But this is a way just to make sure that you don't have too high a percentage of returning users. I wanted to break out or keep separate the content marketing section just because how do you know whether your content is performing? It's not like it is leading to a sale or to a lead, at least at this stage. People are just reading your content. How do you know if people enjoy it or people don't enjoy it? And this is where looking at your Google Analytics can really help, or any of the other analytics tools that are available. First up is a pretty obvious one. You would be looking at your engagement off-site, so on the different channels that you have distributed that content. If there are more engagements or the engagement rate is higher, then that is a good indication that your content is being well received. You would also want to look at your session duration. The longer, the better. It's a good idea to estimate how long it would take the average person to read your piece of content or watch your piece of content. Okay, that's easier because you know exactly how long the video is. But yes, session duration would be important to monitor here. I must add that in many cases, video content is really not housed or hosted on a website. It lives on YouTube. And in that case, you would be looking at the metrics within Google Ads, for that campaign. Then time on page, which is not the same as session duration. One person can be responsible for more than one session, and the sessions are an aggregate of all the pages that they have visited, whereas the time on page metric is something that you can look at per page. The top pages, you'll very often, or almost 100% of the time, you will see that the home page is the top page in terms of traffic, so volume. But then you can drill down and see the other pages within your site that are performing. And by performing, that would depend on what you're looking at. You would look at each URL, for example, and then see within those what is the time on page. If perhaps you might decide that the URL that has the highest time on page is your most valuable page, and therefore you need to look at that more closely. It really does depend on the circumstance. Then your bounce rate. This is something that has come up a lot and will, just because it is really important. But when it comes to content specifically, it is something high on the list that you want to be monitoring. If someone is clicking to your site, to your piece of content from an external source, and then immediately bouncing with a low time on page and session duration, then you know that it's not quite working. You would also want to monitor your exit pages, and then if there are specific or there's a high volume of drop-off from certain pages, you can then really realistically assume that there is a problem there. Then your backlinks would be something to monitor. I'm sure you know this already, but I just want to confirm what analysis is. And it's getting a better understanding of performance by breaking it down, so segmenting it into smaller parts using data, logic, and experience, and in some cases, additional tools or software. So we are going to move on to something called a PCA, which is a post-campaign analysis. The advantages of a PCA for a marketer or an agency would be to understand performance of the campaign versus the objectives, to learn which segment or segments of your target audience performed. You can see which content or ads performed best, and you can know what to replicate and avoid for future campaigns. Super, super important, that last point. The advantages for a client would be very similar, but understanding performance of the campaign versus objectives. They would then determine budgets for future campaigns, unless that is something that you are responsible for. and they would be aware of what is required for future campaigns. Perhaps it is different landing pages, or we're going to try different channels. That is something that they will be made aware of in a PCA. We are going to look at creating a PCA. The first step is something called an executive summary. An executive summary is a brief overview of the campaign and whether it met the objectives or not. You would also include 1 or 2 meaningful results or insights to set the tone for the analysis. So tell me, which sentence would be better in a PCA summary? Is it A, overall performance of the campaign was positive and we achieved the objectives? Or B, this campaign set out to achieve engagement with potential consumers across the brand's social channels, and we exceeded our target by 230%. I can't speak for everyone when I say this, because this is so subjective, deciding, which words sound better. But I would argue that B is the superior sentence, just because it includes what the objective was. It was engagement. We also know that it was across social channels only, and it includes the result versus the objective. So what did we actually achieve? In this case, there was a target and it was exceeded by 230%. That is a great opening sentence to include in an executive summary. The brand knows exactly what's going on. The next step would be to give a high-level review. It might sound the same, but we'll go through examples now. A high-level review would be combining results from all the different channels. You would include all the metrics that are relevant to the goal and then the total spend. What I mean by including all metrics is that you would need to pull the data from the various channels and aggregate them into a table, for example. Let's look at an example. If we take the objective of leads, you could say we achieved 200 leads at a CPL of $12 across all channels. So along with a table of all the metrics, some clients might not want to see that at all. You would include this, so give a very brief high-level review of what happened. At the end of the day, the result is all that clients care about. It's really the marketer's job to worry about audience segments, impressions, CTR, etc. But the client really only wants to know if the objective was achieved and at what cost. If we look at another example of sales as the objective, you would say something like, we achieved 145 transactions, resulting in $43,700 in revenue across all channels. Then if we look at a more upper funnel objective like engagement, you would say something like, we achieved 1,013 engagements and an engagement rate of 10.4%, making our CPE $0.44. You would also need to include an overview of the creatives that you have used in the campaign. It's optional whether to include all the creatives that have been used. It really does depend on the client and whether they do or don't want to see that. The most common is providing the top 3 creatives and all their metrics, and then the worst performing ads. And in terms of determining what the top and worst creatives are, it would be tied to the objectives. The metrics to include when you are providing a report on creatives is your impressions, your reach, your frequency, and the ad recall if it's available, the engagements and engagement rate, your CPE, CPM, and CPC, depending on what buying method you have, your clicks, so the number of clicks as well as the CTR. And then if it's a video, then you would include the views, the percentage watched, and the CPV, the cost per view. So you've provided an overview and you have given a report on your creatives, but now it is time to segment that performance. So you're going to break down the results per channel. What you need to include when you're breaking each channel down is the objective, because you might have different objectives based on the channel. For example, Facebook could be awareness, yet Google search could be leads, etc. The summary of performance for that channel, just a high level overview as you did, combining all of the results. The combined results per objective in terms of metrics. Let's say, okay, going back to social, if you have the objective of awareness and you have 50 ads, you don't want to give all the stats of those 50 ads. That would be in the creatives report. You just want to give the overall result of that objective on that channel. Audience segments. So this is more a dimension than a metric. And what I mean by that is that you would have your different targeting, so your different audiences, and then you would break down all the different metrics, so all the different performance based on the audience. You would look at the top performing audiences. Because you would have segmented performance by your different audiences, you would know which has performed, and by performing, it is tied again back to the objective. And just as you would look at your top performing audiences, you would look at your worst performing audiences. You would include insights and recommendations, so any kind of info that you have gleaned from the campaign and what you would recommend for future campaigns. As I mentioned, we are spending time on insights later on in this module. And finally, you would include your lessons learned. And this is where it's really important not to just include the positive things. There will be some negative things within a campaign. There's going to be something that you try and it doesn't work. That is what it is. It happens so much in marketing, full stop. But it's important to let the client know about those things. So then perhaps you can try something else, you can avoid it completely. All those different actions that can result from that. And because we haven't gotten into reporting yet, I just want to clarify that all of these metrics and dimensions are available in the reports per channel. Most of them are not something you need to set up, as long as you have your pixel or your tracking code in place. And of course, you are also tracking your conversions or goals. You will see impressions and reach and CTR and bounce rate and all of those things already. It's not something you have to worry about setting up. And that would be the end of your PCA. I'm going to talk about in which format a PCA would be created, but I want to move on to always on campaigns first. What I like to do when I was doing implementation full time was to create a schedule of what I would have to do daily, weekly, monthly, etc. And I want to share that with you. What I did was I created this list and then printed it out. So it was always there. I always knew what I had to do. Of course, there are other things over and above what had been listed, but these are the actions that should be completed within these different time frames. So if we start with daily, what you would do is you would check yesterday's performance for any major changes compared to the same day in the previous week. And the reason why I say the same day in the previous week is because you want to compare apples with apples, so to speak. You could also compare it to the same day in the previous month, but it should be the same day of the week, just because people behave differently on different days of the week. So you do want to make sure that you're getting an accurate depiction of performance. You would also check your budget and make sure that it is pacing correctly, and if not, make changes, the necessary changes. You would then schedule or post any new creatives. Now, this might not be every day, but of course there will be a day when you have to schedule or post something new, pause something old, so that is what you would do. Then looking at what you would do weekly, you would check the last 7 days' performance for any major changes compared to the same week last month. Again, trying to compare apples to apples. 1 week is not the same as the previous week. What if it's the payday week? What if it's the middle of the month when no one has money? these kinds of things affect your performance. You would also adjust your bids and budget when necessary. You would check your search terms and you would add negatives. This is incredibly important, and especially if you have a new campaign, totally new, you need to be checking your search terms and negatives every day. There will be irrelevant words or phrases that you need to exclude. Even if you have prepped to your heart's content, there will be something that comes up, and you just want to make sure that you're not spending any of your money on irrelevant traffic. This point is specifically speaking to search engine marketing. You would send a short update on performance to the client. This is optional. It depends on the client. It's not a full breakdown of exactly what's happened. It's just that high level overview. So this week we've spent this much, this is the result, and this is the cost per lead or cost per acquisition, etc. That's all they need to know about on a weekly basis. Monthly, you would check the last 30 days performance compared to the previous month and year to highlight any changes. Again, it's comparing to the previous month, apples to apples as much as possible, although year on year would be better. However, of course, if you haven't been running for that long, then you won't be able to do that. Monthly is when you would also do your first or your proper optimization. So you would optimize your campaigns, which would include your bids and any adjustments that you have, your creatives, your audiences, your rules, etc. You would check all of those and optimize them based on the date range that you've chosen compared to a previous date range. You would also check your spend against your budget and adjust. That is something that would crop up in each of these, really, especially if it's a high budget or you're testing something. You need to make sure that you're pacing properly. And this is also when you would send a detailed report on performance to the client. So a monthly report compared to the previous results, the previous month or the previous year. You would say something like, impressions have increased 20%, CTR has decreased 2%, but conversion rate has gone up 50% compared to the previous period. That's the kind of information that the client would be interested in. That is something that you should always ask yourself, is what does the client want to see? If you are on the other side, what does the client want to see? What you would do quarterly is you would check the last 3 months performance compared to the previous months and year for the same reason as all the others. You would also optimize your campaigns, including the bids and adjustments, creatives, audiences, and rules. In some cases, you might not optimize monthly. For campaigns or for products that have quite a long conversion window, there are multiple reasons for optimizing at different times. And again, we will go into this in future. It also depends on your volume. If you have very low volume in a month, then you might not need to optimize until you have a longer date range to work with. Just like some industries only require optimization or full optimization every quarter because we're working with margins or high volumes or different things. So it really does depend. You would then check your spend against your budget, and you would send a full analysis to the client for that quarter versus the previous quarter or the previous year. Again, the previous year is better. And then this time you would also include website analysis from Google Analytics, for example. Yearly, you would check the year's performance compared to the previous year. You would also highlight any trends, any dips or peak months for the client. And this is something that you would easily be able to tell if you're looking at one full year versus the previous year. If there are dips in the same months or increases, then you should be able to highlight that, and it can form then part of your strategy. Maybe you're going to then spend more in the peak months, less in the dips, or vice versa. It really just depends. If this was your responsibility, you would forecast the budget required to meet targets in the new year. And again, if it's sitting with you, you would create and send a full digital strategy for the new year, including what you would require from the client. So new landing pages, designs, budget, etc. So now I would like to go through some tools used for analysis. But if we break it down, if we look at Google Ads, as I mentioned, there are reports within Google Ads that can tell you all of these things that we have spoken about. It's not magical or rocket science. It is there as long as you have your tracking and your goals. All the other metrics will be available to you, and you can add custom ones as well. Then you have analytics, whether that's Google Analytics or another platform that you are using, a great source of data. And if you then segment it by the different kinds of traffic, you can see what Google Ads is doing. And then it might seem really basic, but there's Excel. I can't tell you how many times I have used Excel to do a data dump, to do a pivot table, and then extract information from there. In fact, huge agencies, a couple that I have worked with, still create their PCAs in Excel and PowerPoint. So it's not about what is better or what is easier to use or anything like that. It's what you have available, what works for you, what looks good or fits what you're doing. Use it. There's nothing wrong with it. If we look at social, we have the reports that are available within the different platforms. Analytics, again, you can see which social traffic is coming through, and I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like just now. Excel again, and then in certain platforms you'll have something called audience insights, which is specifically looking at the followers of your page. Then we have email, and the metrics or information would be available via the email service that you're using. So whether it's, let's say, MailChimp or SharpSpring or Reply.io or anything like that, they would have the different metrics and dimensions available within some kind of dashboard when you log in. Analytics is here again, and it will remain. For your website, of course, Analytics is the place to look, as well as something called the Google Search Console. We have mentioned it before, but we will go into it when we look at SEO and analysis or analytics later on. If you are looking to combine your data, which is what you would do for your overview and just overall analysis, these are free tools, something called Data Studio. I really do recommend just having a look at it and play around with it, as I like to say, and see what you can do. It's really nice in that you can create graphs, and then you can add and drag and drop, where you want things to land. I mentioned third-party software, and I just want to highlight that depending on what you're using, other metrics might be available. For example, you could see viewability. We touched on it in the first module, which Google gives a bit of a demo and shows you what that means. And it's essentially the percentage of the ad that appeared on the screen. In some software, or some software shows you this. For example, Moat, M-O-A-T. Then you could also have IMV, which is influencer media value. Then you could see IMV and you could see EMV. This is by no means an extensive list, but if I was to go through every single tool available, we would be here for years. Even though we're going to be covering Google Analytics in lesson 3, I just want to give you a few details just so that you can understand where this data can come from, or these metrics. On the left here, you can see acquisition, and then overview, all traffic, Google Ads, etc. So this is just there naturally. There is, you do have to link some things, but it's really easy to do so. And then you have reports based on all of these different channels. So here is an example of the social overview. You can see by social network, you have YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Google Groups, etc. These are things that do need to be linked but it is simple, as I've mentioned. On the top, you can see the number of conversions, the number of sessions. You can then go into each social network and drill down and find other information. Of course, sessions and the percentage of sessions doesn't tell you much. If I click to view the full report of the social networks, then you can see some more information, the sessions, the page views, the average session duration, and the pages per session. If we just look at YouTube, for example, there's 348 sessions, of which there were 1,267 page views, and the average session duration is 1 minute and 39 seconds. If we look at the behavior report that's available, looking at the top, you can see page views, unique page views, average time on page, bounce rate, and percentage exit. I think now is actually a good time to mention a bounce rate that might look quite high, but it actually isn't. It's very good. Generally, anything below 60% is fantastic. If you're hitting 70, 80, 90, then there's a problem. You can see each of the pages here, starting off with the home page. As I mentioned, it generally is the top volume page. There are 13,564 page views of that page compared to, quite significantly less views of all the others. Again, you can then go into each page and drill down on more information and add dimensions, which we will be covering in lesson 3. If we look at the landing page report, then here there's so much information. You can see your sessions, your bounce rate, your transactions, your revenue, and your conversion rate. So it's all here already. I hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey of your course. Goodbye, everybody.